All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Environmental Law Distinguished Speaker Series. Our topic today is ESG. All you wanted to know, but were afraid to ask. You don't have to be afraid today. You can ask our distinguished speaker questions. You can go ahead and pop your questions in the chat as she speaks, and then we'll address the questions at the end. We'll make sure we leave time for questions. Our presenter is Tanya Nesbitt. Thank you, Tanya. We are really happy to have her. She's a partner at Thompson and Hine. She has a very distinguished credentials, and I will let you Google her and spend your own time deep diving on her background, but I want to give her as much time as possible to speak today. I will share that she has litigated many complex environmental matters and that she serves as the co-leader of the firm's greenwashing defense and litigation group. I want to thank McNeese, Wallace, and Newark for sponsoring today's speaker series. So thank you very much to that firm. And I will hand it over to Tanya.
Thanks, Sarah. I've prepared a PowerPoint for today's presentation, so I'm going to go ahead and share that. Can everyone see that?
Looks good.
Okay, perfect. So thanks for the opportunity to present to Widener Law today. We are going to delve into one of my favorite topics, ESG. I think it's important to really think of ESG as a really unique footprint or thumbprint, meaning that every ESG program or sustainability program is going to look a little bit different depending on the company, depending on where it's geographically located, depending on its stakeholders, depending on where it's doing business. And so ESG is really more so of a process. There's obviously better ways to do it and not so great ways to do it, but there are really fewer hard no's here. I think it's really up to the company and what it can imagine, what it has the capacity to imagine, what it has the capacity to manage from a compliance perspective, and obviously who those companies' stakeholders are. So as many of you may know, ESG stands for environmental social governance. And so it is a set of non-financial factors that companies can use to measure performance in a number of key areas. ESG is incredibly interdisciplinary. So it's hard to sometimes call balls and strikes here. We have some categories that sometimes bleed across areas. And so an example of that is environmental justice, which we'll talk about later. Environmental justice could be an E issue if you're talking about issues related to admissions, if you're talking about communities that may be suffering some kind of health impact associated with whatever the type of contamination or pollution is. And then it can also be an S issue, depending on the types of communities that are confronting the issue, and when you get into things like legacy, contamination, and socioeconomic status, and race, and other considerations that sometimes blend in together with environmental justice issues. So under the E, we have things that we would traditionally think of again as environmental, so air permitting, carbon emissions, we're seeing, a lot of issues now related to things like recyclability, the circular economy of plastics, for example. There are a lot of state bills or state legislation focused on diverting certain kinds of materials away from landfills and making sure that the consumers understand and participate in recycling programs. The S again could be things like environmental justice, as I mentioned, but it could also be things like how do your employees feel about being in the office, right? We're seeing today's workplace has changed because of COVID-19. So we have initiatives to help people work from home, to address things like mental illness, dealing with generational issues in the workplace would also fall under the S. pay disparity or gender pay disparities, people feeling as though there's a path to promotion if they want to stay in an organization, social washing issues that we're seeing a lot more of now. So companies being tasked or called out with having social washing in their supply chain. So that means that they may be procuring materials from countries that utilize child labor or forced labor, or the company's supply chain is participating in things like deforestation of various rainforests, or there's some political stance perhaps that doesn't align with what the company may be espousing. So under the S, you also see a lot of greenwashing claims. And then the G for governance. So that is the responsibility of the board essentially to be the evangelist, as I like to say, for ESG policies throughout the company. And so the board should be setting the assessments, the baseline assessments, understanding who and identifying who the stakeholders are and identifying what those needs are and building trust through this process. There is data that shows that companies that have more diverse boards in terms of both gender and racial diversity tend to be able to envision ESG issues with more certainty and clarity. So risk mitigation would also fall under the board, as well as data privacy issues and I think AI. Right now we're seeing a lot of AI initiatives, and so setting the priorities for how the company is going to interact with that technology and capability would be part of board responsibilities. So as I've already described, and you can see, right, ESG sort of touches every part of the business, and I would advocate that those that are doing it correctly would have ESG embedded as part of the enterprise-wide function of the company. And so it should touch every aspect, and the board should not be interacting with just the C-suite or just legal on the issue, or just the chief sustainability officer. The company has to own it company-wide. So as part of ESG, we talked about the E, and so greenhouse gas emissions falls under the E. We have really three different types of emissions. The first being really the sources of emissions that the operation or the entity owns or controls. And then the other two relate more so to indirect emissions that the company does not own or control, but are part essentially of either company activity. So scope 2 emissions being things related to the goods and services the company may be purchasing, looking at business travel, for example, of employees that work for a company would fall under scope 2 emissions. And then when you look at scope 3, you're looking further out to do a fuller or really complete assessment of what's happening in the supply chain. So that includes third parties, it includes other suppliers, it could include purchasers or the consumer itself, and capturing admissions sort of outside of the direct company operations. The most controversial of scope 1, 2, and 3 are obviously 3. There's a lot of debate as to how to count it. There's a lot of debate as to whether it is quantifiable. There's a lot of debate as to whether we have the right technology to quantify it. And there is a lot of concern, obviously, for the expense and the compliance burden associated with capturing all of the downstream and upstream emissions associated with scope 3. We'll talk a little bit later about the SEC and some of the international mandatory disclosure policies, but right now in the EU, if you were participating in current mandatory climate disclosure frameworks, there would be a responsibility to capture scope 3 emissions. Okay. So when we talk about ESG, it's important, obviously, to frame sort of the case for it. And there have been quite a bit of studies done in the last couple of years that shows that investing in ESG provides company protection in a number of ways. One is that it helps companies obviously manage risk better, and that it can potentially help them also drive innovation. But obviously, um, the ESG disclosures in of themselves have to be sort of taken into context of a global and overarching strategy, right? So after a company does a baseline assessment, sort of understanding where it is and where it hopes to be or wants to be in the future. We see obviously too, based on a lot of this data or research, that ESG is good for a company's bottom line, and that there is a business case. And I think it sort of really boils down to the organization's attempt to really focus on identifying its stakeholders, identifying its priorities, embedding this ethos really throughout the company, and organizing itself. I mean, at the end of the day, it is really a compliance exercise. But if you have all of those ducks in a row, you are much more likely to see the performance correlate financially. So we see that aside from ESG correlating with financial performance, we also see that when we look at today's generation and today's workplace, employees are responding positively to companies that they at least perceive to be socially responsible organizations, whether it be on, again, issues that would fall under the S or issues that would fall under the E or under both of them. But we see that today's millennial or Gen Zer is more likely to stick with a company that is at least trying to take the right approach in terms of its responsibility to its community and overall environment. So we'll look now at some of the regulatory approaches and frameworks. So the Sustainability Development Goals were adopted in 2015 by UN member states, and they represent a call for action by all companies, whether they're developed or developing, to stand in global partnership and recognize that in order to tackle things like climate change and to participate in eco-conservation, we also have to address things like poverty and other types of inequality. And so the Division for Sustainable Development in the UN's Department of Economic and Social Affairs provides substantive support and capacity building for these goals. And the plan is that the goals would serve as the core elements of the UN's agenda for the 2030 Sustainable Development. So in looking at more high-level approaches, we have GRI, which provides the world's most widely used sustainable reporting standards. And you can see here is essentially one of their recommendations about how a company can use these metrics to influence stakeholder decisions and create trust. Another framework is integrated reporting, and it's a type of reporting that discloses and connects financial, social, and governance inputs and performance information, and it essentially helps a company demonstrate and create social value over time. Another framework is the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, and this organization helps organizations prove industry-based disclosures about sustainability-related risk and opportunities that could be reasonably expected to affect the entity's cash flows, access to finance, cost of capital over the short, medium, or long term. And the standards relate to investor decision-making in a subset of 77 industries. To the right of that, we have the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and the goal here is to develop a set of voluntary climate-related financial risk disclosures that ideally would be adopted by companies that would help inform investors and members and the public about the climate-related risks the company may be facing. The disclosure recommendations are structured around 4 themes that represent the core elements of how organizations operate. So those themes are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And then the last organization here is the World Economic Forum, and that is the international organization for private and public cooperation. They've released a set of universal ESG metrics and disclosures to measure stakeholder capitalism that companies can report on regardless of the industry or region. And it's organized around principles or pillars, and those are governance, planet, people, prosperity. The identified metrics and disclosures that align with existing standards and enabling the companies to collectively report non-financial disclosures. Here we have a look at some of the different rating industries. So for different companies, and depending on where that company may be along their journey, an ESG score could be given, which measures their environmental risk. And we're looking at environmental risk in the context of things like energy efficiency, social risk, worker safety, governance risks, and board diversity. And these measures are typically not part of traditional financial analysis, but we see that companies with strong ESG ratings manage these risks obviously better than their peers. And so weak or poor ratings suggest unmanaged risk that could have a negative impact both on the company's reputation and its bottom line. ESG ratings are not, however, a substitute for financial analysis, but rather an extension of that analysis that covers areas of risk that are increasingly becoming part of a company's portfolio. So certainly companies that may be considering acquisitions, for example, may want to signal to the marketplace that they have done this type of internal work and may be more attractive to some investors depending on those ESG scores. Just a little bit about framework standards and ratings. So ESG frameworks help a company's ESG performance and reporting. They're typically established by NGOs and governments, and the reporting frameworks are composed of guidelines, standards, and principles that, when used in conjunction, establish the ESG commitment. Typically, ESG reporting frameworks include a range of performance measurements and guidance on what ESG metrics a company should track, how to structure an ESG report, and how to think about your ESG strategy, looking at different tools, looking at the process, looking at people, your stakeholders, etc. So why should a company use an ESG reporting framework? Well, one, to help meet your stakeholder expectations, having a concrete framework is really transparent. It will create transparency and help build that trust. It's important from a regulatory compliance perspective, depending on if you're publicly traded, for example. A framework is going to help you manage risk and see opportunities. It's also going to standardize ESG performance, so it can help you benchmark your performance against your peers in your industry. Again, it can help you and create a competitive advantage because, again, the use of the framework can help a company demonstrate a commitment to sustainability. And then again, if you are seeking access to capital, a framework can help attract new investments. The ESG reporting standards are a set of criteria that identify a company's alignment or adherence to specific ESG topics. ESG standards are expressed by a refined list of material topics and metrics, such as greenhouse gas emissions, water, or data security. And so again, here we see that it has to be a surgical approach depending on what type of business the company is doing and where the risk may be. ESG standards provide companies and investors with a shared language with which they can identify, assess, and manage ESG risk. Here we see just a look at the different attributes of ESG reporting that obviously don't squarely correlate to financial performance. So a lot of it, again, is looking at who are the influencers, who are the stakeholders, what is within the company's control, what is outside of that influence. doing your benchmark assessments, and then setting your strategic planning. So where are we now historically? Where have we been? What have been the topical or typical issues that the company has faced, and where is it hoping to go? And a lot of that assessment, again, is going to be both qualitative and quantitative, depending on the industry, depending on the stakeholders, and depending on the strategy that the company adopts overall. And so we talked a little bit earlier about the different types of frameworks. This is an example of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And these are just some guidance on how to prepare effective and transparent disclosures. Obviously, a lot of that comes from having reliable, objective, and smart goals, making sure that the relevant information is being collected and presented, making sure that they're accurate, that we're not using vague language, things that we'll talk a little bit later about greenwashing, but things that can confuse the marketplace or break down trust with particular stakeholders. And you want to make sure, obviously, that they are timely and really specific to your sector or industry. Looking now at the regulatory landscape in the United States, we have a federalist system, so we have to look at both what's happening on the state and federal level. So on the federal level, we have the leading agencies are going to be the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and also the Federal Trade Commission. So the SEC has proposed in draft form a rulemaking that would require publicly traded companies to disclose climate risk that are material. That's still in draft form, very unclear its future in terms of the litigation risk associated with the rulemaking, and also unclear whether it will actually include scope 3 emissions. We've heard recently that apparently the SEC wishes to back away from asking companies to disclose scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions under that rulemaking. The SEC also has a ESG task force that is charged with investigating and also taking whistleblower complaints related to misleading statements that are made either in regulatory disclosures or more broadly in company statements. And we've seen them take enforcement action against companies in the last few years related to things that they would have defined as material and misleading. Looking at the FTC under Section 5 of the FTC Act has the ability to bring enforcement actions for misleading and deceptive advertising. And so we've seen the FTC also take use of that enforcement action and bring enforcement actions against companies that it believed essentially was misleading the public about the sustainability or the environmental benefit associated with particular products it was selling. But we also have guidance from the SEC in the form of the green guides, which are to be used by retailers and marketers to help them avoid the practice of misleading consumers about the environmental benefits associated with a product that may be marketed. And so the first set of green guides came out in 1992. They were last updated in 2012. Last year, the FTC indicated that it was seeking public notice and comment to revise the green guides. They got, I believe, hundreds of thousands of comments and are still undergoing that review process to revise them. Unclear when we may receive a new set of green guides. And then we also have here in the United States, obviously, states can make laws on governing climate-related disclosure and sustainability. And so California has been really the state that's come out in front in terms of its attempt to regulate businesses that are doing business in the state beyond a certain threshold, both private and public entities, and seeking really data from those companies related to their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So last year we had a couple of bills in California that actually passed related to climate-related risk. We also had some that required companies to make mandatory disclosures if they were making claims about lowering emissions. Still a lot up in the air in California. Unfortunately, the governor did not fund the legislation, and there's a current lawsuit that has mostly First Amendment claims regarding whether the law violates the Dormant Commerce Clause and the Supremacy Clause and the First Amendment. And so unclear sort of what is going to happen with that particular legislation. But we have other states that are also proceeding. And so New York has a number of similar bills that are pending legislation, same with Washington State. I believe Illinois as well. So we're seeing more states take action in this area. And then I think we'll touch on it a little bit later, but we have CSRD, which is essentially the EU's regulatory scheme related to climate disclosure. And they have implemented a pending or coming deadline with respect to the reporting of multinational corporations doing business in the EU. And so that means a lot of American companies that may have a European subsidiary, et cetera, will still have to report, even though they may not be necessarily based in the EU. But you're going to have to disclose your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions as well. So we talked a little bit again about the SEC's climate disclosure proposal. So again, we're looking at climate-related financial risk over the short, medium, and long term. The SEC wants to be apprised of any strategic planning sort of related to these risks, any types of targets the company may have set, and looking at what is being disclosed and represented through the SEC filings. Although again, we've seen the SEC take enforcement action outside of SEC filings, looking at company statements more broadly. So when you think of that, that could be on the side of a van. If you're a utility company, that could be in a glossy brochure, that could be on your website. And again, looking at obviously the financial statements indicating the impacts associated with the risk. I spoke just a few minutes ago just about the California legislation, and so here it is in greater detail. Essentially, the thresholds are 1 billion and 500 million in terms of gross revenue for the, I think the package is called the Climate Data Accountability Package, referring to SB 253 and SB 261. There are administrative penalties for the failure to disclose for each. The agency sort of tasked with developing regulations, CARB, has not begun that process because they don't have money to start. I think it's estimated it'll take like $9 million for them to set up a regulatory scheme. Unclear what's going to happen since they don't have any money. But I think the bills essentially really are not emissions regulations. It's an attempt by the state government really to get data on how the state is being impacted by scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and perhaps create more policy surrounding that. The other bill that I'd mentioned was AB 1305, which has been a thorn in many a side in the last, I would say, probably 6 months. The language leaves a lot to be desired, a lot of inartful wording, and so there was a lot of confusion as to who the regulated entities were and what they were supposed to do. Some in the industry, particularly we have clients that are in the aviation industry, they've taken the position that they do not have to comply with the disclosure unless they are actually in the marketplace purchasing offsets. Less aggressive interpretations of the legislation would read it to require the mandatory disclosure if an entity was just making statements that said, we did XYZ to lower emissions by X percentage, or we plan to lower emissions by X percentage by 2050, right? So just making that benefit claim would be enough to require the substantiation for that statement on the company's website. We see that the drafter of the bill in, I want to say it might have been December, so before the bill went into effect, wrote a letter after the governor had signed the bill, basically saying that his intention was the bill wouldn't take effect, I believe, until January 2025. Nothing really seems to be happening with that in terms of, I guess, legislative action, maybe to get some type of extension or amendment. And there's, as far as I'm aware, still no litigation on 1305. So we'll have to sort of see if there is any enforcement action taken. The bill itself, I think, required the AG's office to enforce. So possible that, I guess, the California AG could bring litigation. Also unclear as to whether there'll be actual enforcement. So a few minutes ago, I spoke about CSRD. So CSRD is the EU law establishing ESG-related reporting requirements in the EU. Again, it's meant to impact both EU companies and foreign entities with EU connections. So again, if American company has a significant presence in the EU or has a subsidiary, et cetera, they're going to be subject to the law. It is a navigating the reporting requirements is enormous web, and there's been some concern or desire for, obviously, the American mandatory disclosure legislations, particularly the SEC's draft rulemaking and the state laws, to sort of use the same framework so that companies don't have to make a different report for each regulatory scheme and can repurpose their reporting to lighten the regulatory burden. So CSRD will begin in 2025, and here is some information just about entity size and who will have to report or be required to report. So as you can see, the ESG initiative is a huge regulatory and compliance lift or burden for a company. And so a few years ago, we were curious as to how companies were grappling with all of these questions, concerns, and how they were responding. And so we did a survey sent out in 2022 to ask companies sort of what do you foresee as your top ESG challenges, and pretty consistently across the survey you begin to obviously see themes, and one of those themes are that companies are concerned about data collection, and appropriately so, particularly if you are in an industry that is associated with emissions that may be difficult to abate. How are you going to collect that? Data verification, not so far behind, right? How, now that you've collected the data, sort of, is it accurate? How do you substantiate that it's accurate? Looking also at green initiatives, and some of that challenge could be claims of greenwashing in that response. Unclear. I get asked what the other category means, and in looking at the responses, and we'll talk about this a little later in the presentation, but in drilling down at the responses, there obviously is concern in companies about the anti-ESG backlash, right? And so a lot of the responses in the other category related to people saying, geez, how am I going to get or build consensus in my company around ESG because people perceive it to be anti-capitalist or fill in the blank. And so how are we going to work to build a consensus and to get people to truly understand what it is and how it may work for the company? these survey responses relate to the draft SEC climate disclosure rule and looking at companies who said they intended to comply. And the numbers were closer, I guess, than I would have picked or imagined based on the public and private sector difference. But we have a number of clients in the private sector that plan on adopting the framework and approach as part of its ESG policy. Looking more closely again at greenhouse gas emissions, again, focused again, particularly on scope 3, because that is the more difficult emission type to assess. Here we're indicating, who plans on reporting those emissions. This slide likely would look different now that the SEC perhaps has indicated that it may back away from scope 3 emissions. I wonder. But we see here, I guess the private sector had the higher of the response. Here again, looking at third-party assistance. So a lot of companies will get certifications, will use auditing metrics to verify the information that they've collected. And so we see here the breakdown between public and private and those that indicate they were using or planning to use that type of verification for the data that they're reporting either to the public or to a regulator. Another thorny issue is that of supply chain. And so trying to assess how companies are obtaining information about what's happening in their supply chain. Are they doing it through contractual arrangements? And it looks like here the majority were not. And I would venture to guess that this juncture in the ESG journey, many companies likely were not thinking very closely about supply chain at all. It would be interesting to see how that number maybe has shifted if we looked at it today. Customer demands again for ESG information, looking at the types of information people are asking for. So obviously DEI data, a lot of information about the racial composition of particular areas of a company, its leadership, its C-suite, its board, looking at information regarding gender or pay disparities, emissions, obviously another sort of big factor as well. Also seeing company requests in a number of areas related to a carbon disclosure project, which I think is similar to the greenhouse gas emissions. EcoVadis reporting. EcoVadis is a rating agency looking at OECD goals. So the OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Companies that are either participants in these organizations or are aware of things like EcoVadis may ask for information to see if your company is doing the same thing. Information about conflict minerals, again, that is part of the S or the social washing. So understanding how and where a company may be sourcing minerals from. And worker safety, again, not to be forgotten, understanding sort of how a company is thinking about worker exposures and safety, particularly if there's hazardous waste, hazardous chemicals. We talk about that all the time as part of the E in ESG. When building an ESG program, obviously legal is a key component of that, but there are going to also be other players in that, and one is the use of consultants. And so consultants can be tremendously helpful in helping a company build an ESG report, understanding its supply chain, understanding which framework or standard or rating may be useful. Again, this is not a one-fits-all approach, and so everyone can't use the same framework that Amazon uses, right? Because not every country is Amazon. You may have different climate risk. You also may have different social risk, right? So you have to find really the baseline and find the tool that works best for the particular industry. Consultants can help with verification of information or substantiation of data. when I spoke earlier about the state climate legislation, AB 1305, for example, authorizes members of the public to challenge a company about its substantiation, which also creates legal risk, which we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But you may want to have a consultant sort of help you prove up your work. So you say you're net zero. What does that mean? What does it mean to a consumer? And if somebody were to ask you to prove that, what information would you give them? Consultants can also help with life cycle assessments, which are important to substantiate claims made about greenhouse gas emissions or other environmental benefit claims. They can help implement sustainability projects. So if you want to start a zero waste to landfill program in your offices, a consultant can help you do that and sort of identify what that would map out what that would look like. So building a successful ESG program begins with a materiality or priority, I call them baseline assessment, but really looking at what are the primary focus areas for the company vis-a-vis that of the stakeholders. So again, if you are in an industry that relies heavily on fossil fuels, what is that going to look like? If you are in an industry that deals, you build plants, for example, in local communities, what is your social strategy? What is your environmental justice strategy going to look like? Where are you now and where do you hope to be? And really measuring that across the matrix of potential issues and concerns. For some companies, climate-related risk may be the chief concern. For others, it may be social. But you have to have the conversation, do the work, and take the steps to be able to understand what you need to prioritize, where you need to build trust, and where you need to build buy-in. So again, as part of that assessment, you're looking again at stakeholders, so your employees. I hear from people very often concerns about millennials and Gen Zers. How do we help them capture their attention? How do we help them stay in the workplace? What do they want? What do they care about? Looking at your customers and understanding also where you are in the supply chain, because you may be in the supply chain of larger companies, depending on company size. If you are larger, you may have your own supply chain, and so you need to look to see sort of what your suppliers are doing. Looking at board members again. Shareholders, again, if you're publicly traded, what are your shareholders interested in? We've seen that recent litigation related to Exxon and the shareholder demand there to divest from fossil fuels. If you are in an industry where you are looking for potential access to capital, potential investment, what are your potential investors interested in looking at? So these are just some examples. Again, I talked about sustainability projects, but looking at ways to reduce footprint, divert from landfills, employee retention, diversity and inclusion, employee wellness programs. Those are all ways to implement the strategies. And then again, these are just more examples of things companies can do as part of their strategy of ESG. So we talked a little bit about environmental justice. This administration has really taken a whole of government approach to implementing environmental justice policies through executive order. Generally speaking, environmental justice is the fair treatment of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, income, with respect to the enforcement of environmental laws and regulation. This particular administration has taken quite an interest in remediating legacy contamination and pollution, and has allotted many millions of dollars through the Inflation Reduction Act to have local community deployment on these particular types of issues. I get asked often if environmental justice is going to go away in lieu of the Harvard admissions race decision. My answer is no. I don't think it will. It may look a little different. It may be a while before EPA is able to get a test case through, perhaps in a favorable circuit. But we're seeing a lot of the environmental justice issues being recaptured to focus on health and safety impacts to communities, and local communities have had success in being able to challenge the establishment of different businesses, plants, et cetera, that would have those types of impacts in their communities. In terms of building a successful ESG program, again, these are some of the component parts, obviously looking to integrate ESG into the enterprise management of the company is increasingly important and vital. Being able to set appropriate goals and track measurement toward them. Looking at industry peers, right, and being able to benchmark against them. One last point on this is always advise companies to develop an ESG counsel. We had a client not too long ago that received a civil investigative demand from an AG, a state AG's office that asked for information about sustainability. And the legal department was tasked with responding to that CID, but had not looped in the sustainability team. And so there was risk of making statements that weren't actually accurate to where the company currently stood in its sustainability journey. And so with creating an ESG council, you will get all of the key company stakeholders at the table, and the ability then to say, hey, we received this response that implicates our sustainability efforts, both past, current, and future. Who are the key people that need to be part of this conversation before we respond and create legal liability or risk for the company? Another example, I guess, of this process can be mapped out in what we call a RACI matrix, which is a responsible, accountable, consulted, informed matrix, which is a valuable tool for stakeholder management in projects because it provides a structured approach to defining and communicating responsibilities within a project. And so you can see here, obviously, it's very clear what legal is to own, what the ESG team is to own, what finance is to own, what the CEO is to own, et cetera. Turning to the anti-ESG movement. So not everyone is a fan of ESG. And really, I really think the divide happens along political lines in the states vis-a-vis or akin to any of the recent electoral maps. On the state level, we see that in bluer states, we are getting more pro-ESG policies or initiatives. In the red states, there's a lot of legislation on preventing essentially industry boycotts, so industries that don't want to do business with gun owners, for example, facing penalties for those types of boycotts. And a lot of the state legislation is in the banking arena or deals with state-funded pension plans, so saying a state pension fund can't invest in particular ESG funds. I think this patchwork is going to continue, and we're going to have really a fractured system. And so companies that are doing business in all 50 states need to be mindful of the differences across the state lines. Looking at the board and ESG, again, I'm a big believer in that the board has to be the evangelist for ESG. And so here we see a survey of percentages based on how responsibilities are shared. Is it through a committee, and what type of committee, or is it delegated really to the full board? I'm going to skip the next slide just for the sake of time. So we can talk a little bit about greenwashing. So greenwashing really is the practice of making misleading or intentionally false claims associated with a product's environmental benefit. Greenwashing can occur in a number of different arenas. And so we've seen most of it start with the recyclability of consumer products, and greenwashing claims now have expanded really far beyond that into other areas like utilities and other services as well. So those types of lawsuits are on the rise in the last couple of years. I would say most of them deal with product advertising or corporate representation. Some of them include shareholder disputes. So you have a situation where a shareholder is saying the board's failure to take action or the board's action caused the share price to fall as the basis for the cause of action. Some of it involves climate, obviously. We've seen a lot of climate litigation against major oil companies regarding their statements on how fossil fuels impact climate. Generally, these cases deal with state consumer protection acts, allege unfair and deceptive practices. Many of the cases also rely on the green guides. And so this slide just gives you an example of the types of different forms of greenwashing. Vague symbols. We've seen a lot of carbon neutrality lawsuits lately, companies that make selective disclosures, empty claims or promises that the company has no intention of meeting. And again, the green guides really are the guidance. So sometimes the complaints cite to them. We've seen situations where courts are relying upon them in their orders, as well as the leading federal interpretive guidance on whether a specific claim is deceptive or misleading. Here are just some general mitigation strategies. Obviously, it's important to think more broadly about just a specific claim. When looking at greenwashing, you have to think much broader than just the package or the advertising. Where else may you be making claims? Are you making claims on the side of a truck? Are you making claims on social media? Obviously, collecting data to substantiate those claims along the way is very critical and important. And now there are state laws that authorize consumers to approach companies to ask for that information. So you need to review your claims on an ongoing basis. Also important to think about how you are collecting and verifying data, because what you're not collecting, obviously, you're not aware of, and you're going to have blind spots and vulnerabilities there. Some other examples of things, obviously, to think about, or a company should be thinking about as part of their planning, particularly in their contracting. Are your liquidated damages provisions enough? What happens if you are setting a net goal target, but then the footprint of the company changes, right? So then you have additional people or entities in your scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions. How are you then sort of going to reassess that information? So these are just, again, some issues that we're tracking for 2024. Lots of uncertainty, I think lots of development still on the regulatory front, lots of litigation still to be decided. But we've come up with, I guess, top 10 priorities. And I think I've mentioned these, so I wanted to leave time for questions. But again, these are just sort of best practices about setting realistic goals and making sure you're prioritizing, the particular parts of the ESG agenda or parameters that are important for your company, and using the frameworks and ratings appropriately to help you, really. That's what they're designed for. So I'll stop now so that we can take questions.
Thanks, Tanya. That was wonderful. Yes, you deserve that drink of water. That was very comprehensive. You were really able to fit a lot of information into that presentation, and I really appreciate it. Anyone with questions for Tanya can go ahead and put them in the chat. And I'll be happy to try to facilitate the Q&A here. We've got about 10 minutes before we have to sign off. I will throw something at you, Tanya, to get the ball
Sure.
rolling here. So the state laws, that seems like, and I understand we're we're sort of at the very beginning stages of that, and the California law doesn't have
Yeah.
funding yet. But I mean, that seems like it could quickly create a very confusing patchwork of compliance requirements for companies. So, I mean, how do you see that going? Do you think the intent of that is to try to force some more federal guidelines, or I guess I'm kind of asking for a crystal ball. What do you think is going to happen there?
Yeah, well, so I guess I will say a couple of things. The first is that when he signed the legislation, Governor Newsom was very vocal in expressing concerns about the burden the disclosures would place essentially on companies that may have to report into CSRD or to the SEC. And so I think at a regulatory level, there is an awareness that, like, hey guys, you guys actually have to work together to make this less burdensome. Whether that will happen still remains to be seen, because one, CARB can't make regulations without funding, and two, we still don't know what the SEC is going to do on scope 3. But I think if it is just scope 1 and 2, well then yes, we have maybe an argument that it's not going to be as burdensome. And if the entities ensure that, you know, the CSRD reporting that I did can also be used to satisfy California and the SEC, well then maybe we've done a little bit to lessen that burden. And I think that's one of the arguments made by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that sued CARB recently for the alleged violations under the First Amendment and Supremacy and Dormant Commerce Clause, sued them essentially saying that the regulatory burden is too high and beyond the interests of the state, and perhaps the regulation also has effects and impacts beyond just the state of California, and so you overstepped your regulatory authority. So these are very interesting issues that I think are going to be litigated in the courts, and probably, you know, I can't believe I've become that person to now say the courts are moving faster on these issues, but they are than regulators in the U.S. So we may get decisions on some of the threshold issues much faster than we're getting from regulators, and so it's possible that a court may decide. But it remains to be seen. I was more surprised that AB 1305 actually wasn't the first statute in California that was challenged, because I think just the drafting left so much to be desired. But it's possible that maybe we'll see a lawsuit there as well.
All right, well, I hope we have some top-notch judicial education from folks like yourself. All right, we have a couple of questions I'm going to throw at you. So, how do you compare ESG scores when there are different assessment or measurements?
Right. So the ratings obviously depend on the frameworks and are industry specific. So it's not a one size fit all approach, but you're going to look at the rating within the industry and sector lens to really compare apples to apples, right?
Gotcha, that makes sense. All right, we've got a question from Emeritus Professor John Dernbach, my predecessor. He thanks you for your excellent presentation. Plainly, ESG is not confined to any particular practice area. What would you say all lawyers need to know about ESG?
What should all lawyers know? So I think it's important to understand the regulatory frameworks and to understand what the mandatory obligations are going to be on private and public companies alike. I think it's also necessary to know where the state legislation is moving. So for example, New York is considering amending its State Consumer Protection Act statute, which would make it more plaintiff friendly. And so when advising companies, I think you need to really educate them on those risks, right? We are enabling a public to be able to demand more information than maybe they could have just 5 years ago. And so the way we used to do business obviously is going to change. And I think people need to understand that we've also sort of passed the point of green hushing being a viable option. You know, no, you can't just not say anything because that also has risk associated with it. And it's particularly risky for publicly traded entities as well, given the SEC's stance.
All right. Let's see, we've got a question. Does the push for achieving a higher ESG score possibly give rise to greenwashing? But for ESG score, would companies be more or less likely to greenwash, or is there no correlation? Oh boy.
So I would say that the impetus really for greenwashing, I mean, taking aside that there are companies that end up greenwashing negligently, right? Because they had a blind spot that they couldn't see around, or ESG is just not embedded in the function, and you have people at COP26 talking about, oh, we're this sustainable whatever, whatever, and then, oh, we still use fossil fuels. We weren't aligned really on that strategy or presentation, right? That's not necessarily intentional. So excluding sort of the unintentional actors, I really think the impetus for greenwashing is the price premium, right? That companies understand that there is a consumer that is willing to pay more money to be associated with a service or product that is perceived as sustainable and better for the environment. And so because they want those dollars, they are willing essentially to stretch the truth or go to the line on claims that perhaps maybe we don't have the data or we can't actually substantiate, or maybe it was true 5 years ago, but 2 years into that, we decided to change course and nobody bothered to update it, right? So it's more of a laziness, if you will, and an intentional movement toward the consumer, the dollars, right? Because there is a lot of money to be made from this, and understanding that. So I think that is more important than I think the rating in particular. That's sort of what is driving the action.
All right, well, I'm not sure how we do the ESG score for pop stars, but I thought that was interesting that everyone was giving Taylor Swift a difficult time at the Super Bowl with using her private jet to get back and forth. I think this issue is here to stay if we're talking about it at the Super Bowl, but I'm just kidding. But thank you, Tanya. You did a wonderful job. I really appreciate everybody joining us today, and yeah, Brian has put the CLE information here in the chat. And thank you very much, Tanya. Good luck with your travel today. And I hope everyone else has a good rest of your day as well. So thank you.
Thanks. I'll just drop my email in the chat if anyone had a question or wanted to continue the conversation. Happy to always chat about ESG. And thanks for inviting me, Sarah.
Oh, our pleasure. All right.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.